Jean-Baptiste Lully was one of the most powerful composers in Europe, and according to the famous story, he was killed by his own music. For most of his life, Lully had lived close to the most dangerous source of power in France, Louis XIV, the Sun King. He wrote for him, danced for him, rose because of him. At Versailles, music was not just entertainment, it was loyalty, it was ceremony, it was power. And Lully understood that better than anyone. But near the end of his life, something changed. The king grew older, the court grew more religious, whispers began to move through Versailles. And Lully, once almost untouchable, was no longer quite as safe as he had been. Then, in 1687, the king recovered from illness. Lully prepared music to celebrate it, a grand sacred work, a public act of devotion, a chance perhaps to stand once more in the king's light. But that music would become the beginning of his death, and the strangest part is not only how it happened, it is what came after. Because when doctors offered a treatment that might have saved him, Lully refused. So how does a composer die from his own music? And why would a man so desperate to stay near power refuse the one thing that might keep him alive? To understand that, we have to enter the world of Versailles, a world where music could make a man powerful, and where one wrong beat could destroy him. Jean-Baptiste Lully was not born at the center of French power. He was born Giovanni Battista Lully in Florence in 1632. As a boy, he was taken to France. He entered aristocratic service. He learned music, he learned dance, and just as importantly, he learned the rules of a world where talent alone was never enough. At court, you had to be seen, and Lully was very good at being seen. In 1653, he appeared in the Ballet Royal de la Nuit, beside the young Louis XIV. That matters, because Louis XIV did not treat performance as decoration. He understood spectacle, he understood image, he understood that power could be staged, and Lully understood it too. From the beginning, his body was part of his ambition. He was not only a composer sitting quietly at a desk, he was a dancer, a performer. And on that stage, beside the young king, Lully found the relationship that would define his life. The king became the sun, and Lully learned how to orbit him. Lully's rise was fast. By 1661, he had become master of the king's music. That title sounds artistic. But at Versailles, art was also politics. The palace was a machine of rank and attention. Every gesture mattered. Who was invited mattered. Who stood near the king mattered. Who performed before him mattered. And music was part of that machine. Lully did not simply write beautiful pieces. He helped create the sound of a royal France. Ballets, court entertainments, sacred music, opera. He worked with Molière, then he broke with Molière. And after that break, Lully gained something extraordinary: control. By the 1670s, if you wanted to put dramatic music on a French stage, Lully's permission mattered. He was no longer just serving power. He had become powerful himself. But this kind of power had a weakness. It depended on favor, and favor depended on the king. That is the quiet danger in Lully's story. For decades, he had climbed higher and higher because Louis XIV allowed it. But what happens to a courtier when the king begins to look away? By the 1680s, Versailles had changed. The young king who had danced in ballets was older now. The court was more serious, more religious, and less forgiving, and Lully's private life became harder to ignore. In 1685, a scandal broke around his relationship with a chapel choir boy named Brunet. At another time, perhaps it might have passed more quietly, but this was not another time. Religious pressure at court was growing. Opera itself was increasingly viewed by some as morally dangerous. And Lully, who had built his career on theater, pleasure, and spectacle, suddenly looked less safe. Satirical poems and pamphlets began to circulate. His last operas were not performed at court as often as before. He was not totally destroyed, but the temperature had changed. And for a man like Lully, that mattered, because his whole life had been built on closeness. Closeness to the stage, closeness to power, closeness to the king. So when Louis XIV recovered from illness, and Lully prepared music to celebrate it, this was not just another performance. It was a return to the old language, the language he understood best. Music as devotion and loyalty. music as a way back toward the sun, and that is where the story becomes strange. The piece was a Te Deum, a grand religious work. It was meant to celebrate the king's return to health. Picture the scene, a hall filled with musicians, voices ready, instruments waiting, the air thick with ceremony, and in front of them stood Lully, not with a small modern baton. In Lully's time, conductors could keep time with a large staff, striking it against the floor. A heavy beat, a physical beat, a beat you could hear and feel. During the performance or rehearsal of the Te Deum, Lully struck his own foot with the staff. At first, it may not have looked like the end of anything, just an injury. Painful, yes, but not history, except the wound became infected. And in the 17th century, infection was not a small problem. There were no antibiotics, no modern surgery, no clean hospital system waiting to save him. The injury worsened, gangrene set in, and suddenly, the great composer of royal order was trapped inside a body that would not obey him. So was he really killed by his own music? Well, he was killed by the physical ritual of making music, by the old method of keeping time. Because the doctor still had one possible answer, and Lully said no. The popular version of the story says the doctors wanted to amputate, maybe a toe, maybe more. The details vary in retellings, but the central idea is the same. To stop the infection, they needed to cut away part of the body, and Lully refused. It is easy to make this sound like vanity, the composer who loved dancing so much that he chose death over losing a foot. And maybe there is some truth in it, but we should be careful. Surgery in the 1680s was terrifying. Amputation was brutal. Pain control was limited. Survival was far from guaranteed. So his refusal may not have been simple pride. It may have been fear, or the desperate calculation of a man who could not imagine being saved by being broken. He refused amputation and the infection spread. And on March 22nd, 1687, Jean-Baptiste Lully died. Jean-Baptiste Lully gave France a sound. He helped make the court of Louis XIV feel grand, ordered and eternal. But the world he served was not eternal. Lully did not die at the height of simple triumph. He died after the court had begun to shift away from him, after the king's favor had become less certain. He was still trying to make the king's world sound magnificent. And in the end, the composer who spent his life keeping the king's world in time was stopped by his own beat.